Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, December 4th around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking about those CFP rankings that came out yesterday. The thing that I think a lot of people did not want to happen happened. Alabama is back in the field, and we'll see what happens from here. Obviously, that ACC championship is going to be huge. We'll talk about all of it here in a second. Then we'll get to the early signing day, a huge day in the world of recruiting. Obviously, a lot of guys signing their letter of intents today. A lot of teams moving up in the rankings. Texas looking for that number one class in the country. Michigan making a lot of moves today that could be very impactful for the future around there. Boise State UNLV. Want to talk about that in the third segment. Want to give it a little bit of big game breakdown treatment here. Obviously, for a playoff spot for that G5 playoff spot, going to be a huge moment for both those programs. Then we'll get to the other G5 title games. We have four others in the Conference USA, American, MAC, and Sun Belt. Want to break those down and give you picks for those as well as we head into this weekend. And then we got a couple of questions as we head into this weekend. What's the most impactful title game? Who needs to step up the most? What's the game of the week? A lot of different things I want to break down at the very end of the show. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the super chat. Click that $sign at the bottom of the Sports Network chat. Add any question, comment you'd like. It'll pop on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be interactive, especially with early signing day. A lot of different stuff flying around, so definitely want this to be as interactive as possible. Utilize that if you would like to. But let's go ahead and jump into these rankings. Let's talk about that first, and then we will get to early signing day. We'll get to all the craziness that is going to go on today. But let's start with the rankings here, and the thing that a lot of people, I think, wanted to avoid has happened. Alabama is back in the field, and let's just start with the rankings overall. Then we'll get to a little bit more about the actual playoff field. But Memphis and Army get the respect that they likely deserve at the very end of the season. Obviously, Army has the game this weekend, so could fall out of this if they were to lose. But at the end of the day, been a really incredible story from both those teams. And Memphis had a very tough start to the year, but was able to kind of rebound, a huge moment for them, and definitely deserves the respect to be in this ranking at the very end. Syracuse, Colorado, Illinois, all kind of in the same boat. They all just kind of had a great season, now are looking to possibly push it to 10 wins. I know Colorado is going to have just about everyone playing in their bowl game. Haven't heard necessarily anything from Syracuse and Illinois. Will be interesting to see if guys like Kyle McCord or a guy like Pat Bryant is going to suit up for those games. But definitely a really fun trio there. Three teams that were a ton of fun to watch this year, and definitely getting a little bit of love at the end of the CFP process. UNLV, you're in a win-in scenario, no doubt about it. You being ahead of Army takes care of any question of that being the case. You were playing Boise State for a spot in the CFP. Could be just a huge moment for the Rebels and kind of a huge comeback. Coming off that Syracuse loss, it felt like they were kind of gone and done in the CFP race, but with all the craziness that's happened in the group of five this year, they found their way back up. Even with two losses, they're still in this thing and can avenge one of those losses this weekend against Boise State, and we'll talk about that game a little bit later. But Missouri is Missouri. I don't think we have to talk about them too much. They're a little bit of a resume booster. I'm not necessarily saying they shouldn't be here, but definitely a team that I think we all just know is going to be here. I think we all know we don't necessarily love that they're here. But at the end of the day, BYU's in no man's land at 18, and frankly, so is kind of South Carolina and Ole Miss at 14 and 13. They're in really, really tough spots as you move forward. None of those teams are going to be able to make the dance. Obviously, South Carolina, Ole Miss, and those other two teams we'll talk about here in a second was a big topic of conversation. At the end of the day, I didn't have a big problem with where they landed. I think Ole Miss has a reason to be upset, but at the end of the day, you lose to a 4-8 Kentucky, that's really going to hurt your chances. But at the end of the day, it's going to be interesting to see how all of this kind of works out, because you do have those three teams from 15 to 17. Those are all in the win-and-then scenarios. You know, Arizona State, Iowa State this weekend, and then Clemson obviously trying to kind of shock the world, find their way into the dance at 9-3 or at 10-3 if they were to get the win, and you're in a position where you're probably going to be that 12th team. You're probably going to be the team on the outside looking in. Maybe you'll get a little bit of a bump over the Big 12 champion. We'll see how all of that kind of shakes out this weekend, but definitely something to watch. You know, will Clemson get that bye at the 4 spot? Will they stay below the Big 12 champion and then be the 12, or be in a position to have to go on the road to a Penn State or to a Notre Dame or to an Oregon possibly? So a lot of different things at play here in the bottom half. Obviously, not the most impactful part of the rankings by any means. Definitely the group that is definitely on the outside looking in of this thing, but then you have kind of the logjam of those two up there and then these two down here with 12 and 11 of Miami and Alabama. Frankly, I would have put Miami all the way at the bottom of these four teams between South Carolina, Ole Miss, Miami, and Alabama. I did that in my rankings yesterday. I would have done it in these. Understand why they didn't. I understand you kind of want a little bit of a buffer. Maybe it's a little bit of just sending a message to everyone that this is where we're drawing the line. Alabama's above it. South Carolina and Ole Miss are below it. But at the end of the day, I don't necessarily think it makes all that big of a difference. I would have had Miami below the other two, but understand why they didn't. Miami, you're effectively out. I don't think any turn of events that could happen this weekend that would find your way into this thing. You are in a really, really bad spot moving forward. And it's one of those things. You lose 2 of your last 3 games to 2 unranked opponents, you're going to have an issue. Obviously, Syracuse is a team that's kind of kicked up into the rankings this week, but when they played them, was an unranked team, definitely a team that they probably should have been able to take care of, and they weren't able to. So I'm not necessarily super disagreeing with that. I fully understand where they're coming from with that one. Bama, you're in right now. I think you would likely fall out if Clemson were to beat SMU, and SMU gets the at-large bid. We'll see what happens there. SMU's at 8. I feel like that's enough of a gap, but definitely one of those things where maybe it's just the margin of victory for Clemson one way or the other if SMU were to fall out. I would firmly put them in almost regardless of what happened this weekend. I understand that's not the sentiment of everyone, so we'll see what happens there. Obviously, I think if SMU loses, they should be in. If Clemson loses, obviously Alabama will find their way in. SMU will be that 3rd seed, but for Boise State, you're in a great spot. You are in a win and buy scenario, no doubt about it. You have enough space between you and Arizona State where there's really no chance of you losing that bye if you get a win. You'll probably be the 4 seed, maybe the 3 if Clemson were to lose this weekend and not jump ahead of you. I don't think that would happen, so you would be in a good position to possibly get the 3 seed if Clemson were to win this weekend and you would slide up one more spot. Would be a little bit crazy. I don't necessarily love that Boise State gets one of the buys, but understand when you look at the resumes, they stack up just a little bit better. I just don't think it's the right 4 teams. I think it should be the 4 champions from the Power 4, but understand that Boise State's had a great year, so it'll be interesting to watch what happens there. Indiana, you're in a great spot. I don't think you're really moving that much. Maybe you slide down to 11. Maybe you stay at 10, the 10 seed, not the 10 spot, but it'll be interesting to see what happens there. The Tennessee-Ohio State debate was one that was kind of going around the Twitter sphere the last couple of days. I didn't really think it was much of a debate. I thought Ohio State definitely deserved to be over them. They have 2 wins over CFP teams compared to Tennessee's 1. They both have 2 losses, one really good, one really bad. I didn't really think of it all that crazy. I understand that Ohio State didn't drop all that far after losing to a Michigan team, but at the end of the day, you got more data points this time of year. So going to fall quite as far later in the year than they would earlier because you don't have to be as reactionary. You have a full slate of games to choose from and to kind of pick from, and frankly, they should be looking at the full 12 slate when they're making these rankings, especially this late in the season. But moving on from that, Georgia, you're in a great spot. I think they could stay steady at the 7 seed, could drop to 8 depending on what happens this weekend. They're likely the 2 seed if they win the SEC. I don't think there's really any two ways about that. If they beat Texas, even if Penn State were to win or lose, they're firmly in the 2 seed spot. Notre Dame is 4 in the rankings, but 6 in the seeds when we get into this thing here in a second because of their conference situation. I don't think they could move up. I think they're pretty much set at that 6th spot or maybe even a little bit lower if Texas were to lose. I could see them kicking Notre Dame down one spot and Texas into that 6th spot, but definitely will be interesting to watch. And then Penn State, you're in the spot that you expected to be in. You're probably in the best spot in the entire tournament, frankly. If you lose this weekend, you have the 5 seed, and it's a very, very nice path. If you win this weekend, you might just be the 1 seed or at least the 2 seed and in a great position to move forward in this tournament. But let's talk about the actual bracket because that's what everyone's worried about right about now. It is SMU getting the bye is the only new thing here. You have Oregon, Texas, SMU, and Boise State. Those are your bye teams as of right now. You have Ohio State, Tennessee as the 8-9 matchup. Makes total sense to me. I understand some people were pushing for Tennessee over Ohio State. I'm more leaned Ohio State, so understand where they came from with that. If the Tennessee receivers have to go up to Cole Columbus, that's going to be an interesting matchup. And frankly, I think that one might just be set in stone. I don't think that one's changing really. I don't see any real movement at those 2 spots. So I do think that one's relatively set. I think we will see Ohio State, Tennessee in Columbus in the playoff at the end of the day. UGA, Indiana is another one that I think could be set. If Georgia were to lose this weekend, I do think they would likely stay at that 7 position above Ohio State and be in a position to possibly play Indiana at home. maybe they could kick down a spot. Obviously, they could kick up a couple of spots if they were to win, but that would put them in the bye scenario, so not necessarily quite as impactful as a lot of the other things. I think Texas would maybe slide down to that 6th position, kick Notre Dame to the 7, and they would kind of play around with some different things from there. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Penn State, you're in the 5 position, and frankly, if this is your path forward, I'd rather be in your spot than Oregon's, if I'm being totally honest. If you're playing Arizona State and then Boise State, FanDuel released their odds actually on the Josh Pate show, and they would be favored by 11.5 against Arizona State, probably be favored by about 11.5, maybe 12 against Boise State. So they would be in really good shape. Oregon would have to play Ohio State or Tennessee in their second round. I'd much rather be Penn State in this scenario. Another issue with this format that we're rolling out there. So it is a huge issue. I would have Penn State as my 3 seed. I would have them as the other bye, and then I would have Notre Dame as the 4 seed. Understand that's not the way it works, but at the end of the day, I think this is one of the other examples of why this is likely not going to kick around for too long. We will likely have a very different format here pretty soon, and we'll see what happens then, but this is definitely a very broken setup. And then Notre Dame, Alabama, the one that everyone saw and got a little bit excited, although Alabama being in got plenty of people upset. I think this was a very fun matchup. It sounds like Notre Dame would be favored by a little bit more than a field goal, so definitely will be interesting to watch that one unfold. It's one of those games that just be 2 elite programs on one of the most storied fields in college football history. It would be absolutely incredible, and although it would be Alabama in the field where a lot of people would be upset, I would definitely be more than happy to watch that game. I think it would be so much fun to watch, and definitely one of those things where you're getting closer and closer to this thing. Feels like Notre Dame and Penn State are in really good positions. If everything goes chalk this weekend, this is going to be the bracket that you likely have. You're likely going to have all of these teams right where they are right now. Maybe there's a couple of different movements depending on the results, but the way that I see it, this is probably what you'll have if everything goes chalk this weekend. If Clemson wins, if some other things happen, if Georgia wins, if Penn State wins, there will be some movement in terms of seeding, but I think we have roughly the 12 teams. I think we have 13 teams. Well, we have more than that, but in terms of the spots that are being filled, I believe we have 13 teams for 12 spots. I think we're in a position right now where it really comes down to that ACC championship. If SMU loses, I do think SMU should be in. I can't promise that they will be. I do firmly think they should be in. And then there's some seeding stuff that we'll play around with. Bama could be out with a SMU loss. A lot of different things going into this rankings, and definitely gives us a very clear view. I don't think there's a lot of intrigue going into this weekend. We know what the group of 5 position is going to be between UNLV and Boise State. We know which one is going to affect a lot of stuff in the ACC championship, and we know it's Bama. One way or the other, it's going to be Bama in or Bama out, maybe SMU in or Bama out. It's going to be really interesting to watch all of this unfold. Definitely one of those things that we're getting closer and closer to this thing. People are getting madder and madder, as you would assume they would. But at the end of the day, going to be an incredible tournament regardless. We will obviously have Selection Sunday this upcoming Sunday, so we'll update that on Monday's show, no doubt about it. But we'll talk about that in more depth throughout the week. But let's take our first break here. And when we come back, we got early signing day. We got to talk about all the stuff going on. We'll talk about the top classes, some classes to watch throughout the day, definitely some big-time flips and commitments that have already happened. And then we'll talk about a couple of people that you're going to want to watch throughout the rest of the day because they could find a way to flip towards the end of it. But we'll break it all down after this, so stick with us.